The Seahawks' 4-game win streak came crashing down in a lopsided loss to the Packers on Sunday night. Now, Seattle finds themselves in a battle for the playoffs with virtually no room for error. ESPN's Brady Henderson sits down with me to discuss where to go from here. Let's light him up.
I'm Jacson Bevins, and this is Cigar Thoughts.
Welcome back to the Cigar Lounge. I am Jacson Bevins, and along with my placid producer, Mike Barwin, this is the Cigar Thoughts podcast. And we're recording this on Monday, and the game last night is just as ugly in the light of day as it looked under the lights. But for as bad as that loss feels, Seattle is still 8-6, and the road to the postseason, while more overgrown than it was a few days ago, is still there. We'll talk about that and a lot more with Brady, but first, Cigar Thoughts is proud to be sponsored by Seattle Cigar Concierge and Glenfiddich Single Malt Scotch Whiskey, two companies whose products I enjoy on a regular basis. Look, by now you know the deal with the cigars too. They're fantastic, and it's not just me saying so. Feedback has been incredible. It's very, very encouraging. This is a big risk for the show, putting those out there, and it's awesome to see how many of you have been enjoying them, buying them for yourselves, friends, family members. And look, Christmas is coming up. If you know a stogie lover in your life, this is an awesome opportunity to hook them up with something unique and something that if they enjoy cigars, they're really, really going to like. Again, it's 10 cigars for $149. You can use the link on the show page, or you can go to cigarthoughtsnfl.com, follow the link there, and get them, like I said, for yourself or for someone else. You know, Mike and I, we love doing the show, and there are two ways y'all listening and watching can help support it so that we can keep these episodes coming. One is by purchasing those cigars, and the other is by subscribing to our YouTube channel at Cigar Thoughts, where you can watch full episodes as well as the funny and insightful clips that Mike puts together. Give a thumbs up to the stuff you like and let us know what you think in the comments. And of course, you can listen to us everywhere you get your podcasts. Look, it started bad and got ugly last night. The Packers left no doubt in a 30-13 stomping in Seattle. Joining me to talk about how it went down and where Seattle goes from here is one of the most insightful beat reporters in the game. He is ESPN.com's Brady Henderson. Brady, welcome back, brother.
Thanks for having me. It's fun to talk to you every week, and now this week on your podcast. So we're getting plenty of each other this week, aren't we? Yeah,
we are. And you know, for those who may not be aware, I join Brady Henderson and Mitch Levy twice a week, talk Seahawks on the Seahawks No Table. So if you're not checking out the Mitch Unfiltered podcast, make sure that you are, because we have a really, really good time there. And it's thank you to you, Brady, for bringing me in on that. It's been really fun. I wasn't sure what to expect, but it's three guys talking ball, and it's my favorite thing to do.
Yeah, and at least one of us knows football. It's been great to get your football insight on there, just to raise the level of, Mitch and I tend to screw around a lot. No, it's a great segment, and you've been a really cool addition to it.
I appreciate that very much, my friend. Well, look, man, I think games like last night, they're less fun to talk about, but I think that you can learn sometimes a lot more about the team when they struggle than when things are going easy. I think that's just true of people in general. And they struggled last night. I mean, they lost this game in just about every phase. We'll obviously talk about the Geno injury on the show, but besides that, what stood out to you the most?
Just that they got pushed around for at least the first half of that game. And the defense did a nice job of adjusting, after falling behind, 20-3 at halftime.
Right.
And they did a better job throughout the course of the game of bottling up Josh Jacobs. But it was just, I think that game was just discouraging on a number of levels. And even if you eliminate the Geno Smith injury, if Geno Smith finishes that game and he never goes down after hurting his knee or anything like that, I think this game would be kind of a reality check in a few senses anyways, just because they're going to have a hard time now making the playoffs.
Yes.
They no longer are leading the NFC West. I'm sure you've gotten into all the sort of different playoff scenarios now.
I actually haven't. So I'm actually excited to chat about that with you as well.
So let's just reset it. So they no longer lead the division. They're now technically tied with the Rams, but the Rams have the head-to-head victory. So if the playoffs ended today, the Rams would be NFC West champions. And look, it certainly looks like this whole thing is going to come down to that Week 18 rematch with LA at SoFi Stadium. But as it is right now, the Rams are technically leading the division by virtue of that head-to-head win, even though they have the same record. And then when you look at where the Seahawks would end up in a potential wild card situation, Washington has one more win than them. They also have two more conference wins, which that's really significant if it gets that into the event of a tiebreaker. So if the playoffs started right now, they'd be out of the playoffs because Washington would be ahead of them for that third and final wild card spot. So they're going to have a hard time catching Washington. And it seems like it is NFC West for bust with this team in terms of whether or not they're going to make the playoffs. And as I said, when we talked earlier on the Mitch Unfiltered podcast, this was the kind of game that does not inspire a whole lot of confidence that they could do anything in the playoffs, even if they got there. Right. Because Green Bay might be the worst possible team that they could end up facing in the first round, and Green Bay just manhandled them. Again, they fought back in the second half, but Green Bay is clearly a notch above them, and so it's hard to imagine them doing a whole lot in the playoffs, even if they get there. Now, they could end up playing Minnesota conceivably, and we'll see what they can do this Sunday against Minnesota. But that was just, even the Geno injury aside, that was just a discouraging performance, I thought.
Yeah, I thought so too, and frankly, this week couldn't have gone any worse for Seattle's playoff chances. I mean, everybody won. The Cardinals won. The Buccaneers won. They're up to 8 wins now. The Vikings won. The Lions lost, but who cares? I mean, so far behind them, that doesn't matter. The Commanders almost gave it away to the Saints backups. Yeah. That would have been nice. And then, of course, the Rams beat the 49ers back on Thursday. So Seattle lost a game to the entire field. And when you only have 3 games left and you don't really have any of the tiebreakers outside of over Arizona, then, that hill all of a sudden got really steep when it was a lot flatter a week ago.
And I think one of the reasons why they could be in trouble in terms of trying to beat the Rams for the division title is the Rams have the easier remaining schedule. And again, they play in Week 18 at SoFi Stadium, and it's probably going to come down to that Week 18 game. But you remember the Rams, they have the Jets in East Rutherford this coming weekend, and so and then they have Arizona, who beat them pretty handedly earlier in the season,
right.
But that Jets game is as close to a gimme as you could maybe get for them, and so they're not gonna. There's not a great chance that they're gonna lose ground between now and that Week 18 game.
Yeah, the Rams, they've been a funny team this year, and really they've been 2 different teams this year. They had that awful start, 1-4, and just it felt like everything was on the verge of collapse, and then they've gone 7-2. And, in those first 5 games, they had some bad losses. They lost by 4 scores to a Cardinals team that Seattle has swept. They lost to the Dolphins when the Dolphins were not playing anything close to their best football. But in the last month, they've beat the 11-2, now 12-2 Vikings, the 11-3 Bills, and the 49ers. And they almost feel inevitable. And so now that puts Seattle in a position where it really does feel like they need to win out to get in, which is kind of crazy because that puts them at 11-6. And I did not think it was going to take 11 wins to make the playoffs in the NFC.
Yeah, I figured 10 would probably get you at least a wild card spot. And so, the Rams are a tough team to figure out. They've been really up and down. I mean, you mentioned they're 7-2 in their last 9 games. One of those losses was to a pretty underwhelming Dolphins team. They also got hammered at home by the Eagles when Saquon Barkley ran all over them. Not that there's any shame in losing to a very good Eagles team, but the way they lost that game with Saquon just going completely off on them on the ground, it's just a hard team to really put your finger on. And then, how much can you really take away from a game in the rain, a Thursday night game at that? And so the bottom line is they're a tough team to beat, and they have been for the last few years a very tough team for the Seahawks to beat. That said, like in that November game right before the bye, that's a game the Seahawks feel like they really should have won. That and especially the Giants game. I mean, in some of their losses, and the loss to Green Bay was a good example of that. Like, they just got beat by a better team. San Francisco, that game that first meeting, San Francisco has obviously tailed off, but the 49ers outplayed them in that game. It wasn't a case of the Seahawks making a ton of, self-inflicted wounds. Sometimes you get beat by a better team, and that's what happened last night, but it's not what happened in the Rams game. The Seahawks, felt like they should have won that game, and because they lost that game and because they lost the Giants, that's why they're in this position that they're in, where you're talking about maybe having to eke it out and going all the way to Week 18, when if they had taken care of business, it would have been a lot easier road over these next 3 weeks.
Yeah, the NFL is constantly reminding me that teams are not static in terms of where they are in the hierarchy. Like, yes, at the extremes, you've got the Eagles and the Lions and the Bills and the Chiefs, and I would say the Vikings and Packers, maybe even the Ravens. Like, these are good teams, but even those teams have had bad weeks. And then at the very bottom, you've got the Giants and the Panthers and the Titans and the Jags, the Jets look completely useless most weeks, and they jump up and beat good teams. Every single one of those terrible teams that I mentioned have beaten a good team this year. And so, the Rams are vulnerable, but doesn't feel like it right now. That being said, Seattle felt really good coming into this game, and I don't think it's a surprise that they lost. I am surprised how they lost. I guess it's not shocking to me that the Packers came out and were really good on their first couple of possessions, because that's what Matt LaFleur offenses do. Their scripted openings are sensational. Josh Jacobs is having a phenomenal year, but it was Seattle's offense's inability to keep anything on the rails that really surprised me. Seattle's offense has taken a step back from where they were early in the season. Fortunately, it's coincided with the defense stepping up their game. But when the defense wasn't there in the first half, the offense couldn't pick them up. And I think the most discouraging thing for me, and you and I talked about this on the Seahawks Note Table on Mitch's show, is how badly the Seahawks offensive line regressed after by far their best game of the season in Arizona. All of a sudden, the weakest part of Green Bay's entire team is their pass rush. I think when they were doing the intros, they highlighted their leading sack guy, and he had 2.5 sacks. And they completely manhandled Seattle's O-line. And that was just so discouraging to me.
Yeah, playing at home too, where you typically, you feel like your offensive line may have a bit of an advantage. And coming off that week last game against Arizona, 0 sacks for the first time all season, only allowed 2 quarterback hits. And maybe it's just a matter of styles make fights, and maybe this was just a worse matchup for them than Arizona was for whatever reason. But it was another, I used the word discouraging earlier. That's another discouraging showing by that group, where you thought that they were finally making some strides, finally kind of building some cohesion after all those moving parts over the first half of the season, and to see them lay an egg like that, that's not good. Now they did lose Oluwatimi in the first half due to the injury, and we'll see what happens there.
And he'd been playing well last couple of games.
He had, and that was kind of the I guess for them, fortunate irony of that whole situation is they thought Connor Williams would be an upgrade over Oluwatimi, and it turns out Olu was the upgrade over Connor Williams, because Williams was not playing all that well when he decided to retire. And so, Olu had been a stabilizing force for them, and if he's unable to go, that's just another blow to an offensive line that really cannot afford very many of them. And you're right, Green Bay, they had gotten a decent amount of sacks, but in terms of pressure rate, pass rush win rate, that was a bottom 5 pass rush in terms of both of those metrics, and they came in and really had their way with Seattle's offensive line.
What are you seeing from Abe Lucas? Because what I'm seeing are stretches of, that's that guy. That's that guy that was like getting some all-pro votes as a rookie. And then there were other times where I was like, when did Stone Forsythe come back? Like, he just got absolutely blown by a few times. How much of his struggles are, this guy couldn't do this on his knee for basically a year and a half, and there's he's just getting used to the massive strain of playing every down, versus he's lost something because of the injury.
Over the first couple weeks, I would say it's most likely a conditioning thing, because when you talk about being off for as long as he did. I mean, there's going to be just some technical rust, like mechanics wise, when you go that long without playing football in a live setting. But, I imagine there was also like, you really got to work your way back into football shape when you don't have training camp to do that. You don't have the offseason program to do that. So, if you were asking me this question a couple weeks ago, I would say it's probably that. But now he's been back for, 5 games? And certainly, like, you could tell that first game back. By the end of that last drive against San Francisco, I mean, the guy was clearly gassed.
Yes.
It's just the longer he's been back, the harder it is to point to the conditioning as being a factor. Maybe it is. I don't know. I've never attempted to do that, and maybe it does take longer for a big guy like that. But it does make you wonder if it's beyond the conditioning and maybe just that the knee is still giving him trouble. You never know. I mean, he disputed the idea that it was a chronic knee injury. I think we all have to agree on what the definition of a chronic knee injury is, because there's been conflicting reports.
Well, here's the thing. If you play in the NFL, you are chronically injured. You are getting injured to some degree every single game. But yes, I receive the spirit in which he says that.
Yeah, and so I guess the point I'm trying to make there is we just don't know if the knee is still bothering him, or if it's just a matter of knocking off the rust and getting back into football shape, or if it's that plus, he still maybe doesn't have the power that he would like to have off that knee.
One of the kind of cornerstones that I keep coming back to all season is that this is a diagnostic year for Seattle. There are not a lot of guys on long-term contracts. There's not a lot of guys who are under contract beyond even next year with this team. And it's a tryout for a lot of these guys. And it's also a really big evaluation stretch for the front office, because there's some big money decisions that need to be made over the next year and a half. And maybe I was too optimistic, and it was so murky, all the injury or all the information, to your point, surrounding Abe Lucas's injury. But I just felt like, okay, the tackle spots are good. Like, we can worry about other stuff. Abe Lucas is a question mark for me now, and he's not the only one. Another guy that I think for most of the year I really felt was having the kind of bounce back that was going to earn himself a long-term spot with this team is Riq Woolen. And look, you look at the metrics, you look at the graphs where it's, average separation allowed in man coverage versus zone coverage, or passer rating when targeted in man coverage versus zone coverage. Riq Woolen is in the desired quadrant for all of it, because he's had some really, really excellent shutdown games. Mm-hmm. He's had a couple of stinkers, and last night was absolutely one of those. And what good play callers do, which Matt LaFleur absolutely is they identify a weakness and they hammer it over and over and over again. And that is what Jordan Love did. He hunted Riq Woolen yesterday.
Yeah, and that's a sign. And Woolen had the the late hit on Jordan Love on the first possession. Then he had the pass interference. Look, I don't really mind the late hit. I mean, for one, you're taking a shot on a quarterback. Not that he's trying to hurt him, but
nope.
He's probably hasn't. I don't see him blitzing a whole lot, so he's probably not in a lot of positions where he has to really have he really gets a chance to get a feel for the timing and like what's bang bang versus what's going to get you a penalty. So I would sort of remove the late hit from his night. But even then,
I'll be honest, I had completely forgotten about it when I said that.
I think it was
I'm fine with it. If that was Devin Witherspoon, I wouldn't have thought twice about it.
Yeah, it was on the first drive, and so much, easy to forget what happened after that one because there was so much. But I think even then though, there's still, just you saw, like to your point, you saw Jordan Love go after him, and you mentioned about all the decisions and all the guys who, aren't under contract beyond next season. Like Woolen is one of those guys who this is his third season. So this means that he'll be eligible, as will several other players from that 2022 draft class, for a new contract. And I think some people might look at that and say, okay, well, you can always find a way to keep everybody. I think you can I think that's generally true when it comes to finding the cap space to do it. You can manipulate the cap,
sure,
and you can structure contracts a certain way. You can use contracts like ATMs for cap purposes and move money around to create cap space. It's a lot harder to do that with cash. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions about the way NFL teams operate is that they just print money and that they can find $20 million in the couch cushions. That's just not the reality. Maybe
I'm so glad. Please speak on this, because this is the stuff that really, really helps inform our conversations about who should get extensions and who shouldn't.
Yeah, like when I talk to people with the Seahawks and when I talk to people with other teams, the thing I hear a lot is that they didn't have the cash to do it, right? It's not the cap space. It's they don't have the cash. That when the Jets, for example, I think the Jets were interested in trading for Frank Clark a few years ago when the Seahawks ultimately traded him to Kansas City, but they had gone on a huge spending spree in free agency before that, and they just didn't have the cash to do it. So this is not exclusive to the Seahawks. This is probably every NFL team, maybe aside from maybe the Cowboys, and maybe there's other teams in there who have a ton of cash. But it's a misconception that teams can just find cash and teams have endless supplies of cash. The owners maybe do, but it's not always, the owners aren't always giving the general managers carte blanche to spend all their money. And so the point is, as it relates to the Seahawks, is they're not going to be able to pay all these guys who are going to be eligible for extensions, especially when you're talking about one of those guys being the quarterback who could be in line for extension averaging something in the neighborhood of $40 million a year, even on a short-term deal. That would eat into your cash budget, as will Boye Mafe if you extend DK Metcalf. Charles Cross, maybe Ken Walker. Abe Lucas is probably in a different category because they want to see how his knee is. But the point is, you've got a lot of guys who are eligible for new deals. You only have so much cash. And when you're looking at who could be potentially the odd man out, then I would wonder if Riq Woolen could fall into that category just because of some of the up and down play and because of what a talented guy might be able to get you in a trade. Now, they don't necessarily have to make that decision this offseason. He still is under contract for one more year, the fourth year of his rookie deal. So they don't necessarily have to do anything with it, but it's going to be part of their thinking this offseason. And who are you going to pay?
Well, and I'm really, really glad that you brought up this aspect of it, because the dullest part of my blade, as someone who's trying to understand the NFL as best as he can, is the cap and all of the different machinations that go into how you can work it. And there's a reason why, NFL front offices are filled with Ivy League support guys, making sure that, they're beveling whatever edge they can in order to make everything work. But I think one of the things that's really important to keep in mind, and also, please correct me if I get anything wrong here, but
sure,
one of the ways that you create cap space, we hear about teams doing all the time, the Rams did it for 5 straight years, is you can create cap space by guaranteeing money that wasn't previously guaranteed. But when you guarantee a player's contract, I didn't know this until the Russell Wilson trade. This is how I learned about this. You have to cut a check and put that guaranteed amount in escrow. That money is out of the owner's account when you guarantee it. No matter when the player receives it, that money is already out of the owner's account. And that's where you start to see the difference in owners and which owners are willing to swing their nuts around and cut big checks that are out of their account to have these players that they want. And Paul Allen seemed very willing to do that. I don't have a great sense with Jody how willing she is to cut those checks, or even for how much longer it'll be her decision to cut those checks. But just as, for those listening and watching, as we have the conversations about whether they should pay these players and how much they should pay them, I think it's just really important to at least have a baseline understanding of how the underpinnings of that work.
Yeah, and it's a good point about Jody Allen, and we don't know, whether she, we don't know, sort of, so much of her is a mystery because we've just never heard from her beyond, like a quote in a press release. And so, I think it's fair to wonder, is she as willing as her brother was to spend money? Your point about teams having to put cash in escrow when it's guaranteed, I believe that's when it's fully guaranteed. But to your point, That's another roadblock, and it's sort of an antiquated rule, but it is an issue for, I think, the vast majority of NFL teams. And going back to the idea of how you create cap space, the most common way of doing that is it's called a simple restructure, where you convert a money that a player is going to make in base salary. So let's say the guy has 2 years left on his deal, and he's going to make $10 million in base salary this coming season. So you convert almost all of that. You subtract the minimum base salary and you convert the difference. So let's say it's $8.5 million. You convert that into a signing bonus, and then you spread, for cap purposes, that $8.5 million is spread over 2 years. So in that case, you would create, I don't know, $4 million and change or something.
Yes, right.
But when you do that, that's a signing bonus that the player gets in cash. Now, even if you defer some of that signing bonus money, and we're really getting into the weeds here, I may be boring people to death here, but
no, man, trust me, man. Trust me. There's people out there that are just like, yes, thank you, finally.
Yeah. Now the Seahawks and a lot of other teams, they defer some signing bonus payment. Technically, a signing bonus is a bonus that you get upfront for signing, but a lot of times part of that payment is deferred. But even when you are deferring that payment, let's say you defer half of that payment to several months down the road, to a year down the road, that's still another cash obligation that you have to take on. And so, it's the bottom line. I think that the takeaway that listeners should have listening to this conversation is there's the cap and then there's the cash, and teams don't always have the cash to sign every player and keep every player that they may want to, even if they could find the cap space to do it.
Yeah, like I said, there's definitely people listening who are grateful for that. That was a very selfish question for me, because I want to know how that works, and I really appreciate you diving into that. And you laid a great foundation for a question I'm going to ask you later. But I want to zoom back in to the Seahawks team, because you look at the scoreboard and you see 30 points, and you see that Jordan Love was deadly efficient. And you see that Josh Jacobs put up some nice numbers, even though it was basically all in the first quarter. To that point, I was actually kind of encouraged by the Seahawks defense. Like, they picked themselves up off the mat. The Packers scored touchdowns on their first 2 drives, I believe, and then field goals on their next 2 drives. And then after that, even though in the second half, they basically had a short field every single time, Seattle did a really nice job of keeping them out of the end zone and giving their offense a chance to get back into the game. Now, the offense never did that, but I'm not as discouraged by the defensive performance as I might have been if I just saw the final score.
Yeah, I mean, so let's just recap how it went. So Green Bay scores on its first 4 possessions, 2 touchdowns, 2 field goals, and then started the second half, it's punt, field goal, punt, fumble, punt, turnover on downs. And so even that touchdown they got late, I mean, that was a short drive where they took over after the Geno interception, or after the Sam Howell interception. And that required a hell of a catch in the back of the end zone to get that touchdown.
Great play.
Yeah, so this defense, like, they've got a lot of dogs on that unit, and they've got a lot of guys who aren't going to fold. And that was the case earlier this season, where they were getting pushed around, for a good chunk of the first half of the season, and then they totally turned their run defense around, albeit with different personnel in several spots. And so there's a lot of things to build off of that defense, even if the first half was pretty forgettable and pretty god awful, and even if they got kind of pushed around, I think it wasn't totally being out physicaled up front. I mean, Ernest Jones told us post game that it was kind of being unready for some of the motion that Green Bay was throwing at them, and every offensive coach who comes from the Shanahan tree is going to be way up there in terms of pre-snap motion. So it wasn't that they weren't expecting the volume of it. I think it was the types of it that caught them off guard a little bit, and that's why it took them
LaFleur's the fucking adjust. Man.
Yeah.
Matt LaFleur, that dude's got it.
He does. And, I think Packers fans have been spoiled in terms of coaches over the existence of that organization. And I think Packers fans probably
They have
quibble
like
about
4 coaches and 4 quarterbacks in their 80-year history.
Yeah, exactly. And Packers fans might quibble about some of his challenges. He does not have a good record on challenges, but his record as a head coach, starting off with a couple 13-win seasons, I don't think he's won fewer than 8 or 9 games since he took that job over in 2019. So that guy, yeah, he knows what he's doing.
You're in the locker room. You're covering these guys every day. You do just such a brilliant job of it. It like makes me proud to be your friend, knowing that like this guy is killing it with his coverage. It's not just because I like talking to you.
Well, thank you.
But
by the way, that's very nice
of course, man. No, you do an awesome job. You deserve your flowers on it. But thanks. But what makes me so happy to have you on the show after a loss is you really do get the in-person vibe. Like, I get the quotes. You get the in-person vibe from these guys. And I know, the vibes are down after a loss like that. But you talk to these guys every week, multiple times, and they are coming off of a 4-game win streak. Yes, they lost, and they lost poorly last night, but they've won 4 of their last 5, and were very close to winning 5 of their last 6. As you've seen this defense take a turn for the better, and to my eyes, seem like settling into Mike Macdonald's vision, who are standing out to you as the leaders in that clubhouse on that side of the ball?
Ernest Jones is the first guy that comes to mind.
Already, man.
Yeah, and look, they've got it's not 1 or 2 guys. I think it's quite a few of them. Jaron Reed has always been that guy, I think, or at least since since he was no longer a young guy in the NFL.
Right.
His first couple of years, he was probably deferring to Michael Bennett, Cliff Averill, and those kind of guys, but he's been that guy for a while. Leonard Williams and Mike Macdonald was talking about it on his radio show this morning. It's like guys have their own way of doing that. And, it's with Devin Witherspoon, it's not going to be like he's giving a ton of pregame speeches and stuff like that. It's just guys tend to follow players that have unreal energy and are that love football as much as he does. And so there's different ways of doing it. The thing I'll say about Ernest Jones is that every time I talk to him in a press conference setting or even just see him, the way that he carries himself, I'm always very surprised to remember that he's only 24 years old, because the way that
crazy.
That's
crazy. I watched him take the podium last night while I was writing the article, and it didn't even occur to me that he wasn't 30 years old by the way he handled it.
He just carries himself, and he comes off like a guy who has been doing this for a really long time. And so he's one of those guys. Julian Love on the back end is I think that guy, at least in terms of just the way he approaches his job, and just he just is a professional in every sense of the way, and so every sense of the word. So they've got a few guys, and look, I think if just to take this a little further, I do wonder if that was part of the decision to move on from Tyrel Dotson. And obviously, I think there was 2 decisions there. There was a decision to bench him.
Yeah, peel the layers back a little bit.
Yeah, he wasn't playing well enough. He wasn't playing physical enough, and he was. I think Mike Macdonald made it pretty clear that a lot of their issues in run defense, that was a second level thing. And so there was the decision to bench him, because it felt like Tyrese Knight, even if you had some rookie mistakes, you were going to get better overall play, and there's more upside with a rookie, like that. And so that was the decision, I think, to make the change in the starting lineup. I do wonder, as solid of a guy as Tyrel Dotson is, I wonder if kind of some of the leadership dynamic may have played a role in that, because he very, to his credit, I think, tried to assert himself as a leader. Like when you're playing middle linebacker, that's a natural leadership position. I just wonder if that maybe wasn't a great fit with some of the other very established leaders in that locker room who have been doing it at a high level for a long time. Some of them been doing it in Seattle at a high level for a long time. And so I kind of wondered if maybe there was, I don't know, awkwardness is the right word, but maybe if they just didn't feel like it was a great fit once he was no longer going to be starting.
Is it fair to say that the suit that was tailored for Bobby Wagner fits Ernest Jones better than it does Tyrel Dotson?
In terms of the role, you mean?
Yeah, just being the green dot guy, being the, like you said, the leader of the defense. Like, you kind of are the de facto leader or one of the de facto leaders as middle linebacker when you've got the green dot on your helmet, even if you're not necessarily the best player on the defense.
Yeah, and what did Aaron Donald say when he retired? He said that
I know
that Rams defense was now, I can't remember the exact wording, but he was basically passing the torch to Ernest Jones, and it didn't work out with the Rams. That's an organization that just traditionally has not paid inside linebackers a lot, so you figure that was pretty much a contractual thing and feeling like they weren't going to be able to re-sign him. And then he goes to Tennessee, and Tennessee, they also had to pay Kenneth Murray too. And so the Seahawks saw an opportunity with a bad Titans team to make that trade, and they did. And Ernest Jones, he is playing at a really high level. I don't know if he had his best game or at least his best first half last night against.
No,
Green
he
Bay,
got put in the blender in the first half.
Yeah.
I've spilled a lot of ink in praise of Ernest Jones, and I'm not even coming down hard on him because this is what Matt LaFleur does. But he got caught yesterday.
Yeah, he did, but he is still, very much an upgrade for them, and so it's Ernest Jones is another guy that they're going to have to pay because that's
right.
Not a decision you can put off. Like he's a free agent after this season, and so going back to the Woolen conversation about what some of the tough decisions that they're going to have to make. I think Ernest Jones is going to be one of up there in terms of one of their priorities to re-sign.
Yeah, and you're touching on something I want to get to, but we've been dancing around the biggest development from yesterday's game. And full disclosure, we're recording this Monday afternoon, so by the time you're hearing it, there may be more news about this. But as it stands right now, because you and I spoke earlier this morning, we don't know a lot about Geno Smith's injury yet, do we?
No. The word post-game from Mike McDonald was that the initial indications were that structurally it was okay, and I think what that means is, and I'm not putting words in his mouth, this is just kind of what I assume from when he said that, was that the ACL appeared to be intact and that there wasn't a break. That's just my interpretation of that. That's not hard and fast exactly what he said. He just said it appeared to structurally be intact, and so it doesn't look like it's a season-ending type thing, but I think they've got to get the test done Monday in order to find out, more about his chances of playing this Sunday against Minnesota. And the one kind of nugget that McDonald did give on his radio show was that he was texting with Geno in the morning, Monday morning, and Geno seemed optimistic about it. But a lot of that's going to be up in the air until they get the test results, and then maybe even until later in the week till they see what he's able to do in practice. But certainly, when you look at how Sam Howell played, it's impossible. I'm just going to say this: it's impossible to imagine them winning with Sam Howell at quarterback against a lot of teams, but certainly against a very good Vikings team. Yeah,
and look, it's an unavoidable truth. I didn't mind the trade for Sam Howell because I see a lot of Drew Lock in him. And Drew Lock seemed like a useful, competent backup for Geno Smith, but certainly not in position to challenge for the main gig, despite what some of my replies on Twitter might have said last year. I said this in my article last night that in a lot of NFL cities, the most popular guy is the backup quarterback. And despite what Geno has done this year, that's the case for some Seahawks fans. I don't know that there is anything Geno Smith could have done on the field last night that made him more money than him getting hurt and Sam Howell coming in.
Yeah. And I think it was going in that direction where like the Seahawks are going to have to pay Geno at least something. And we could get into like what that deal might look like. Paying him doesn't necessarily mean a 5-year extension for $50 million per season. Like, I think there's a lot of middle ground there where it could be a shorter term deal for, something $35-40 million, something in that territory per year. I mean, but like what are the Seahawks alternatives at this point? It's not Sam Howell. I mean, and then they did think when they made that trade that, even though they said Howell is coming in to back up Geno Smith, there was a thought, and maybe there still is, that he could be a potential replacement full-time for Geno. It's not a great quarterback draft. and they're not even going to end up with a bad enough record to get them, a top 10 pick anyways. And so they don't have a whole lot of options. And look, Geno is under contract for one more season, but remember, he was unhappy about his contract last offseason when he saw all those other guys get paid, Tua, Goff, Jordan Love, Trevor Lawrence, the list goes on, like other guys who got played. A lot of those guys, Geno has outplayed over the last few years. And I continue to think, Jackson, and maybe this will come out in a report one day, but I continue to think that part of the reason why Geno missed that was 4 or 5 days in training camp was a protest on his part. That I think that was the case. That was not that he was making the injuries up, but that he was willing to sit out a little bit and take his time in getting those injuries evaluated because he wanted to make sure that he was good, but he also, I don't think he minded the Seahawks getting a chance to see what life was like without him, and they saw that again Sunday night, and it was not pretty.
It's so funny. Mike just texted me while we were talking about this. Mike just texted me a tweet from the 33rd team, which is a great Twitter follow for NFL fans. Sam Howell had 5 net yards versus the Packers. That is the 9th worst game by a quarterback with 15 plus dropbacks in any game since 2000. Like, look, Sam Howell is not as bad as his box score was last year. Last night, but what that tells me is just how good Geno has been behind a line that is making it nearly impossible for any quarterback that isn't very, very good to succeed at all, much less be top 5 in number of categories that Geno is. And yes, that includes interceptions. I mean, my God, can we just go like 2 games without an end zone interception? That's got to get fixed if Seattle's going to commit to Geno Smith. But that's a correctable mistake. It's really hard to project what we saw from Sam Howell into something that allows this team to be better in the future than they are right now. And they're not quite good enough right now. And I don't see the roadmap to an obviously better option than Geno Smith. We're going to have the entire offseason to talk about that and more information about the two sides and where they're at in terms of leverage and intention is going to come out. But the game was over once Geno Smith was ruled out. Like there was no confluence of events that was going to allow Seattle to even get back in the fight. The only time they scored was on their best blocked play of the game where Charbonnet ran it in from 24 yards out. Other than that, man, it was absolute disaster piece.
Yeah. And, if you go back to when Sam Howell sort of got his mini audition over the summer, before that, he was really struggling in practice. As somebody who was there every day watching it, saw every throw that he made, like the accuracy and it seemed like kind of the timing was just very off. And, the one thing you hear Seahawks people talk a lot about, whenever Mike Macdonald is quoted on this, and what I've heard behind the scenes is that the guy is tough as hell. And the thought was that, his best qualities aren't always going to show up in practice because it's not a live setting. But when the bullets start flying and you are actually playing an actual game, you are really going to feel this guy's toughness and how much of a competitor he is. And I think to some degree in the preseason, you saw that he was better in the preseason games than he was in practice. And we'll see if that carries over, if he ends up playing and gets, a week to actually prepare for that game. It doesn't have to come in off the bench cold, getting dropped into a really tough situation.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, and I probably wasn't explicit enough in my article. That was a brutal situation for Sam Howell to come into.
Yeah. Right. And, there's multiple ways of looking at that, because when you're a backup quarterback, you don't really get to decide what the circumstances are. Your job is to come in when you're called upon. And he was awful. I mean, he was awful. I think it was a 3.3 total QBR. I don't remember the last time I saw anything like that.
It felt completely hopeless on every single play.
Yeah. And the word from Mike Macdonald on his Seattle Sports Radio show was that it wasn't a matter of Howell being unprepared. Like, it wasn't like this guy had just slacked off and didn't know the plays or didn't know the protections. Like, from a mental standpoint, he was prepared to play. I think it was just, I got to imagine that, like, when you don't play, I mean, he only played one snap. I think it was the Atlanta game where Geno had to miss a play and Howell came in. When you don't really play for that long, I think the timing as a quarterback, I think there's an opportunity for that to really get out of whack. And what you saw last night was a guy who just did not have great timing. And their offensive line was really struggling, but I think there was plays where he's just got to get the ball out quicker, especially once it becomes clear that, your offensive line is having a hard time. Like, you can't just sit back there and think you're going to have, 3, 4, 5 seconds on every play.
If Geno Smith is going to miss some time, because I want to look forward to this Vikings game that's coming up. If Geno Smith is going to lose some time, let's say he doesn't play this game. If you're Ryan Grubb, how are you changing the game plan to go from Geno Smith's skill set, experience, leadership, et cetera, to Sam Howell's?
Yeah, it's a challenge for all the obvious reasons, but then I think one that may be easy to overlook is that Grubb's offense, with all of the pre-snap shifting and whatnot that they do, my understanding, and this sometimes gets a little unclear, but my understanding is that some of that is predetermined. Some of that is based on what Geno sees. So they go up, they go hurry up, or they go no huddle. They get to the line of scrimmage, gives Geno Smith plenty of time to diagnose. And once the defense kind of declares what it's doing, then he has the ability to kind of go to an audible based on what he sees, or shift into something else based on what he sees. And so I think a lot of that shifting pre-snap that you see is based on what Geno is reading at the line. So I think just beyond the production and beyond the touchdowns and interceptions, like, Geno has done a really good job of operating what is kind of a complex offense. And so that is another layer of difficulty that you talk about when you're inserting the backup, is like, aside from just getting the ball out on time and throwing accurately and making good decisions, like, if Sam Howell is in there, you've got to wonder how well is he going to be able to operate that offense just from the head up. And so how does Ryan Grubb do that? I don't know. Maybe he simplifies it. Certainly, you have to imagine that he leans more on the run game. You just can't ask your backup quarterback, Sam Howell, to drop back, 35, 40 times a game. Maybe
not against Brian Flores, man.
Yeah. I mean, maybe the score dictates that. And if that's the case, then they're in a whole world of trouble. But I just think that, and this isn't probably the deepest level of analysis you're ever going to hear, but when your backup quarterback is in there, I really think you've got to take as much pressure on him as you can by running the ball.
Yeah, I mean, make no mistake. I said earlier, the backup quarterback is often the most popular guy in town. Once they're on the field, it is very, very difficult to win. Like, you'll see stretches of backups come in and play really well and win games, but it feels like it's going to be really tough. And yeah, they are going to have to run the ball well, I think, to have a chance, even if Geno is playing. To that end, Charbonnet has been very good last 2 weeks, and it's coincided with Grubb and the offense utilizing a lot more pulling linemen and trap blocking scheme, which I think suits Charbonnet really, really well. The comparison I made a couple weeks ago in the article was in the same way that really good quarterbacks throw a ball over the middle, and when you see the camera angle from right behind them, it looks like they're throwing it straight to two defenders, and at the last second, the receiver cuts into the frame and catches the ball. That's how Zach Charbonnet runs at the line of scrimmage. He's running at blocks that aren't there yet, but he has a really great knack for the timing of blocks, and when they're executed well, he's right there to slip through. I love that. I want to see what Ken Walker can do with this same blocking scheme, because that's not how they've approached it most of the season. Is that a shift that in your mind coincides with the fact that Walker has been out? Or do you think that Walker, who I still believe is the superior talent of the two, much as I like Charbonnet, could really excel if they keep this up?
Yeah, that is a good one. I mean, certainly some of those Charbonnet runs that, go for 10, 15 yards, maybe Walker, just because he's the more explosive player, like he can get from 0 to 60 a lot quicker, and he's got 65, 70 in him. You wonder if maybe some of those 10, 15-yard runs go for more. It is a good point, though, that, part of this success they had, certainly against Arizona, could be a matter of that just being Charbonnet being suited maybe to run those types of plays. But I think, and I don't know if that was the idea behind why they did them, the fact that Walker was out and Charbonnet was in. I think it could have just been the fact that they realized that, 2 weeks earlier in that first meeting with Arizona, like they couldn't run the ball. And I mean, they couldn't do a whole lot. Like they couldn't, Arizona kind of got a ton of pressure on Geno Smith. They didn't run the ball all that well. And I think that was maybe Ryan Grubb realizing that, okay, you've got to come up with a different game plan, than you had in the first game. And certainly they did. And I talked to Brock Hewitt about this, who is, he's a really just great analyst,
yes,
in a lot of ways, but partly because one of them is because he kind of has feet in both worlds. He played in college, and he is a college football analyst. He obviously watches the Seahawks very closely, and he's very plugged into that organization. He played in the NFL. And his point was that in college, especially when you have a very talented team like Washington had the last couple of years, you can pretty much line up and play the way that you want to play.
Yes.
In the NFL, it's about how you win this week versus this opponent, and you maybe can't just go up and line up and do your stuff and expect to win every week. It's about how you win versus a specific opponent. And I think that game against Arizona, like the point Brock made, was that was an example of a guy who has spent his entire career coaching up to this point in college, and is maybe realizing that in the NFL, you can't just rely on the same thing throughout the course of a season.
Yeah, and I think it's important to just have some patience. I don't know if Grubb is the guy or not. I'm mostly encouraged this year. Maybe it's just in relief to what they had the previous two seasons in terms of play calling and just being more dynamic, not only before the snap, but immediately after the snap. But when you're at the University of Washington and you have a bunch of day one, day two talent on your team, like a lot on offense, and the best offensive line in college football, you can do some things that you can't do when you have one of the worst offensive linemen or offensive lines in the NFL going against much, much better talent on defense. I think he's adjusted nicely, but man, it is just hard. Even if Geno can play and be 80-90% of what he is, it's hard to see how they beat Minnesota on Sunday.
Yeah, and I think going into that game against Green Bay, I think there was a very good question of where do those teams stack up? Like, which of those teams is better? Certainly, Minnesota is one of the four best teams in the conference.
Yep.
And like you said, Detroit lost, and so Detroit's getting banged up injury wise, and so Minnesota is a really good team, even though this game is going to be in Seattle. I mean, there's another sort of weird question of are the Seahawks better off playing on the road at this point when
Dude, can you talk about that real quick? Because Seattle, it's like 5-6 years now where they're literally worse at home than they are on the road record wise.
Yeah. It feels like it started in, I don't know exactly when, but I remember 2019, they were a very good road team that year. And I just continue to think that there's the idea that like the fans are really loud and that makes the defense really good. I think in times that has been the case, that certainly when that place is rocking, it makes life really hard on offenses to come in there when they can't communicate. But I think sometimes it's hard for the fans to be loud when the defense isn't good. And this defense has been better for the last month or so, but by and large, it just hasn't been a very good defense for the last few years. And so that's really the advantage that you have when you're playing at home, is that the crowd noise makes life easier on your defense because it makes life very hard on offenses. And I just don't know if they've given fans enough of a reason to yell at the top of their lungs for the better part of 3 hours when their defense hasn't been that good. And other people have made the point that there's economical factors that could be in play here where, look, you can get a lot of money.
Tickets, man.
Yeah, you can get a lot of money selling your tickets. And look, I think Green Bay fans tend to travel really well, so I wouldn't look at what you saw and maybe what you heard on the broadcast in that Green Bay game as a sign of, in and of itself, a sign that a lot of opposing fans are coming into this building and sort of taking over. But it's kind of felt like that in the Buffalo game, and I think that was when Geno Smith even made the point that at times it felt like they were playing on the road because the Bills fans were making so much noise.
Last thing I want to touch on before we let you go is, and I say this with a heavy caveat that the next 3 weeks are going to inform this opinion, so I'm not nailing you down to them. But you're John Schneider. You've been evaluating this team. You have a lot of decisions to make. Seattle has cap flexibility, but right now they don't have a lot of cap space. Who are you prioritizing? You don't need to put numbers on it necessarily, but if you're John Schneider, who are you prioritizing this offseason when it comes to keeping guys around based on what you've seen through 14 games?
Ernest Jones. Yeah, Ernest Jones is the first guy that comes to mind. And look, they're going to have to pay Charles Cross because you can't talk about how few offensive linemen there are and how your hands are tied because the college game isn't producing those guys, and then let your left tackle, who's a top 10 pick, who's played well for the most part this season, you're not going to let that guy walk. So you're going to pay Charles Cross. I think Ernest Jones, I think at some point this comes down to like the guys who aren't free agents, like Ernest Jones. That's a no-brainer. He's a free agent, and look, they may not be able to get that deal done before free agency, so they may be in a situation where they're having to outbid other teams, and they may not be able to get that deal done. But with some of those other guys, like I think it comes down to how much are they going to force the issue. Is DK Metcalf going to be willing to play out the final year of his contract? I don't think Geno Smith will. Just again, going back to the idea of like this guy wanted a new contract this past offseason. He said as much. He acknowledged that his agent reached out to John Schneider to try to get a new deal. Geno, when I asked him in Tennessee during joint practices about whether or not he sees other quarterbacks getting paid, and he says, yeah, it's hard to not pay attention to it. So the fact is, Geno wanted a new deal last offseason. He's going to want a new deal even more this coming offseason, and I have a hard time seeing him not really force the issue. And so, yeah, I think they're going to have to do something with Geno. And
is that the first domino? Like, do you have to get that sorted one way or the other before you make the rest of your decisions?
That's a good one, and you would think so because that's going to be the biggest ticket item, and you want to know. How much cap space, but how much cash you've got left over, and that's going to be the biggest item when you're talking about again, and when we're talking about a Geno extension. Like it doesn't necessarily it's not a matter of do you pay him Trevor Lawrence, Jordan Love, type money. It's or even Goff type money. It's like I think if they do a deal, my guess is it would probably be another shorter term deal, maybe 2 or 3 years. Something in the neighborhood of $35-40 million, like something that would give him a nice pay bump, but not break the bank. And so, you would think that would be the first item to do, just so you know what you've got to work with after that. But I don't know if that's necessarily going to be the case because I don't know if I wonder if some of their other guys, like the guys who are actually free agents, like Ernest Jones, I wonder if that may take the priority first.
Yeah, I liked that coming into the season. There is so much flexibility with this roster moving forward because you have a brand new relationship between head coach and GM. I'm all in on the head coach. I'm not sure I'm still there with the GM, and I don't know. I think Ernest Jones, yes. I think if you feel confident in Abe Lucas's knee moving forward, you make that happen. Charles Cross is a no-brainer. Obviously, the people listening to the show know how I feel about Geno and DK for that matter. But man, I don't know that the decisions got a whole lot easier throughout this season. If Seattle was just bad, that would have at least made the decision matrix a little clearer. If they were really good, that would have done it also. And they're just kind of in between.
You mean in terms of like whether or not you keep the team together or blow it up? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I'm not a believer in blowing it up in the NFL because I don't think the nature of NFL salary cap really allows for you to do that the way that fans want to think that you can. Because, okay, you want to, get rid of all your high-priced veterans. You don't want to pay them all that money, whatever. Well, it's going to take you 2 or 3 years if you get everything right to be competitive again. And during that time, you're missing out on the rookie contracts of guys like Devin Witherspoon and Jackson Smith and Jigba and, Charles Cross and Abe Lucas and some of these other guys that are performing at a higher level than their pay. So, no, not so much blowing it up, but I'm just curious how John Schneider is going to look at this roster in his conversations with Mike McDonald if they finish 9-8 and miss the playoffs by a game.
I think that they would probably approach that as, okay, you were talent-wise and like potential-wise, it's a lot better than 9-8, and that they would probably look back at some of those losses earlier in the season and say, yeah, that was a team with a new staff, new schemes on both sides of the ball that was finding its way. And so I would imagine that, especially with the personnel changes that they made on the fly, with getting Ernest Jones and really seeing that Tyrese Knight looks like he could be a very nice player. I think they probably feel good about the talent and the direction of the team and would say, yeah, let's, probably, obviously you got to find some answers on the offensive line. You've got to make some tough decisions, but I would think that they would feel pretty good about the trajectory of the roster, especially knowing that the team that they haven't been able to get past for most of the last 3 years, San Francisco, looks like they are on the decline, and that I would imagine that they would view the core of their roster as being able to, especially with the head coach that they have, being able to kind of take hold of this division over the next couple of years, but in large part because San Francisco, it looks like they're regressing and life is going to get a whole lot harder for them with Brock Purdy coming up for an extension and some of their key players getting older. And you're seeing that, I think, the wear and tear with that team in the age and all the deep playoff runs they've made. And so I would have imagined that even knowing some of the upgrades that they absolutely have to make, starting with the offensive line, and again, some of the tough decisions they have to make because they can't pay everybody, I would think that this organization would feel pretty good about the trajectory of the roster.
Yeah, I'm with you there too. I think there's been more good than bad. And look, Vegas thought this was a 7-win team coming into the season. They've already beaten that. So there's a lot, I think, to be encouraged by. And it's not a terrible problem to have a bunch of good players to make contract decisions with. It's certainly better than the alternative where you feel like you need to go out and get a bunch of good players. That's much harder.
Yeah. And going back to your question about sort of where Geno fits in the potential time frame of when they would do that deal. I mean, now that I've thought more about it, like really the deals that they do, the extensions they do for guys who are under contract, that typically doesn't happen until the spring at the earliest, and then a lot of times like it's right when guys are coming back for training camp. Think of like the Nwosu deal, the Julian Love deal last year, the Nwosu deal the year before that, DK,
Sure.
Years before that. So those, yeah, in one sense, there is merit to the idea of taking care of the big ticket item first, but their history has really been, you take care of the guys who are actually free agents first. You focus on free agency, you focus on the draft. Once you get through those two things, then you start paying guys who are going to be on your roster next year anyways. I think where it gets kind of complicated with Geno is, again, how much is he going to force the issue, considering he sort of tried to do that this past offseason. You figure that desire for a new deal and his patience, that's only like his willingness to force the issue is only going to grow after another season.
Yeah, and this is something just as a final point that we touched on with Sheil Kapadia on the show last week was, as fans, we want these players to be grateful that they're a Seahawk and take whatever money is going to help the team win, and that's all awesome. Like, yes, of course, that's great. And guys holding out for more money or putting management's feet to the fire, to me, is not a show of selfishness necessarily. It's that these guys are loyal to their families first. most NFL players are going to be on a few different teams over the course of their career. And yes, Seattle took a shot on Geno and gave him an opportunity, and I'm sure that will factor in. But at the end of the day, Geno Smith is probably getting one more meaningful contract extension before his earning career at this level is over. And he's trying to set him and his family up. And to me, I'm just on that side all the time.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to understand where Geno is coming from, and like it's hard for people a lot of times to wrap their head around the idea of guy making $25 million a year could be underpaid. But if you just look at where that contract that he signed a couple years ago ranks in terms of annual average at 25, I mean that's like $19-20 million, and he's seen guys who he has inarguably outplayed make a lot more money than him. Daniel Jones was one of those guys making $40 million a year.
That's right.
And I mean,
God, how mad did the rest of the NFL get with that contract?
Yeah. I mean, talk about a team screwing up every single decision along the way with Daniel Jones, drafting him in the top 10, not picking up the fifth-year option when they could have had him for a pretty affordable rate to buy themselves one more year, and then giving him the huge extension. So anyways, that's another story. But yeah, but there's other guys like that Geno has very clearly outplayed, and yet his salary has just gotten, it's fallen to I think it's around 19-20, and so I think there's a middle ground there. Like the Seahawks could bump him up a little bit without making this long-term commitment to him that is a $50+ million year. I just really don't see them doing that. I think that sweet spot could be again somewhere around 35, 40. Maybe $40+ million a year. So I would say somewhere around $40 million a year on a 2 to 3 year deal. If you ask me right now, that would be my guess at what a Geno extension looks like.
Shields said something that I couldn't believe when he said it. Geno Smith's the only quarterback in the NFL making between $13 and $30 million.
Isn't that weird? Yeah.
There's just a giant gap in the class structure among NFL quarterbacks. And I certainly don't hold it against Geno, especially given how he's played in a generally bad situation with the offensive line for wanting to level up into that class with some of those other names that you mentioned. Listen, Brady, I'm a very selfish interviewer because I like having people smarter than me like yourself. Come on, talk ball. I could do this with you all day. You've already been extremely gracious with your time. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you. And again, I just think it's been really cool getting to know you more and working alongside you more and talking football with you. It's been very cool, and I appreciate the opportunity to come on and do it on your podcast. And yeah, like I said, we're seeing a lot of each other this week, so I will see you in a couple days when we're back on the Mitch Unfiltered.
Yes, sir. All right. That is going to do it for today. Brady, before we let you go, let the people listening where they can find you and your work.
Just ESPN.com, obviously, and then Twitter at Brady Henderson.
Once again, a huge thank you to my friend Brady Henderson for spending his afternoon with us. As always, you can find Mike and I on social media. I am on Twitter at Jacson Bevins. That's Jacson. Remember that no K is okay when spelling my name. Mike is on Twitter at Mike Barwin, and the show itself is at Cigar Thoughts. You can catch full video episodes on our YouTube channel at Cigar Thoughts and find the rest of our socials at cigarthoughtsnfl.com. We are also on Blue Sky. I am at Jacson Bevins. Mike is at Mike Barwin, and we are at cigarthoughtsnfl.com. As mentioned previously, this episode is brought to you by Glenfiddich Premium Single Malt Scotch Whiskey. Y'all know I'm a huge fan of all their stuff, and we are thrilled to have them on board as a sponsor of the show. One of the great things about a great Scotch is how well it plays with a good cigar. So once again, we do have our own special release of cigars that you can purchase at a wonderful price as a listener of the show. The release of the Cigar Thoughts Stogies has been successful enough for us to continue offering them for the low price of $149. That's right, you get 10 cigars in a Mylar bag with a humidification pack for $149. And honestly, it's less than half MSRP for this exact same blend when the manufacturer puts their own brand on it. So we feel very, very fortunate not only to be working with them, but to be able to offer them at such a good price. As you know, these Easy Smoke Stogies are rolled with 13-year age premium Dominican tobacco leaf. So you can hit us up on Twitter or Instagram. We'll send you the details directly, or you can go to cigarthoughtsnfl.com, follow the link, and get the Stogies there. Of course, You can listen to this show and read every article, at least for the rest of this season, at fieldgoals.com. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and you like the show, please drop us a 5-star rating, leave a quick review. It really does help. Thank you to all of y'all listening for your continued support of the show. I know you've only got so much time for podcasts in your life, and it is an honor to be a part of that for y'all. Please know that by sharing this show with your friends and on social media, you give us the juice to keep making this happen. We'll be back soon. In the meantime, onwards and upwards, my friends.